The NFC East is one of the hardest divisions in the entire NFL to predict. With yet again another different division winner in 2023, is it going to go to the Dallas Cowboys again, or can either the Eagles, Giants, or Commanders find a way to win the division in 2024? Well, today we're going to be talking about the NFC East and doing my NFC East season preview. Hi guys, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the NFC East, a pretty fun group of teams here. Obviously, the Dallas Cowboys won this division last year. Can the Eagles or somebody else come out of nowhere to win it? We'll talk about that. So the way the video is going to work is we're going to be talking about each team individually for about 2 to 3 minutes. I'll just kind of be going over some brief things that happened this offseason for the team, and then I'll give you like a brief little prediction about what the team will do in 2024. And then in the very end of the video, for about 2 to 3 minutes, we'll just talk about the entirety of the division, both small picture for this year and big picture for the future. And before we hop into the video, around 93% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel, so if you guys enjoyed the video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. But let's hop into the video. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off by talking about each individual team, and we are going to start off with the Washington Commanders. Now, last year, the Washington Commanders were one of the worst teams in the entire NFL. They went 4-13 and had a net point differential of negative 189. And after that embarrassment of a season, they basically overhauled the entire roster. They started off the offseason by, of course, hiring Dan Quinn to be their future head coach. I'll be completely honest with you guys, I did not love the hire, but I do think that if they were going to find a guy who can help them win basically immediately and sort of reset the culture, then I do feel as if Dan Quinn is a decent pickup. Again, I don't love the hire of him. I would have probably preferred a bunch of other guys, but Dan Quinn's okay. For me, the big changes for this franchise come within the roster. This team is going to look night and day different next year than it did last year. Starting off with the offense, you can look exactly into that quarterback position group. Last year, you had Sam Howell as your starting quarterback. This year, you have Jaden Daniels and Marcus Mariota as your starter and backup. I'm very excited to see what Jaden Daniels can do in his rookie season. I do feel as if there is going to be a rookie that's going to step in immediately and perform at a very high level, that it would more than likely be Jaden Daniels, because you look at all the quarterbacks that are going to be entering into a good situation from this past draft. You're looking at Caleb Williams with the Bears, and I think for Caleb Williams, the reason why I don't think he'll maybe shine as much as I believe in Jaden Daniels is because he is in a situation with such great expectations. Then there's JJ McCarthy, who is also surrounded by a really awesome team, but for his situation, he's just very young, and I just don't know if he's going to start right away. Then you got Drake May and Michael Penix, who are two quarterbacks that I don't know if they're going to start at all. And then, of course, Bo Nix is probably in the worst situation of any of the quarterbacks, but I do like a situation with the offensive minds in that team. Whereas for Jaden Daniels, he's heading into an offense with some improvements on the offensive line. They got a good right side to the O-line. I think the left side still needs a bit of work, but you brought in Tyler Biadasz to pair up next to Sam Cosmi and Andrew Wiley. I think that's a pretty solid right side of the offensive line. And surrounding Jaden Daniels, weapon-wise, you have Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, the newly acquired Luke McCaffrey, and Austin Eckler, not to mention Brian Robinson Jr. So I do feel as if Jaden Daniels is heading into a situation with an offense that has enough pieces to surround this young talent. And defensively speaking, this was maybe the worst defense in the NFL last year, and they brought in a bunch of brand new players. Defensive line-wise, you obviously have the great tandem of Daron Payne and Jonathan Allen, but you also brought in some new pass rushers with guys like Dante Fowler Jr. and Dorrance Armstrong. While neither one of those guys are superstar guys, they're good enough to get you about 5 to 11 sacks a season. The linebacking core is just straight nasty with Frankie Louvu, Robbie Wagner, and Jamin Davis. I'm very excited to see Frankie Louvu in the Dan Quinn system. And then your secondary is a work in progress, but I'm excited to see what Emmanuel Forbes can do in year number 2. So in one offseason, they basically overhauled the entire roster, and I do think that does bode well for this team. Again, they were horrific last year, and I expect them to be slightly better next year. As it goes for my expectations for this team, I don't have the highest of expectations. Like, I do think Jaden will have a good rookie season, but I don't predict him to be fantastic in year number 1. With that being said, I do think there is a world where the Washington Commanders end up being actually pretty competitive next year, so I think they'll win somewhere between like 6 to 8 wins next year. I just have a very hard time saying that the Commanders are going to be a good team next year because I haven't seen Jaden Daniels perform quite yet. Next up, let's talk about the Philadelphia Eagles, the team that has been, by most accounts, the favorites to win the NFC East basically since the start of the offseason. We all knew that Dallas kind of got lucky to win the division, all things considered. The Eagles had a midseason collapse late into the year. After starting off the season very well, they had a collapse that was just really embarrassing. And I don't think that you could really imagine the Eagles ending the season off any worse than they did. I do fully expect them to be a better team next year. Even though I don't love the coaches they hired, I still think they're better than what they had last year. And when it comes to the roster, it's essentially the same roster minus a couple pieces such as Hassan Reddick. But again, you bring in guys like Saquon Barkley, you fix up your secondary, you add some different pieces here and there. The offense did lose Jason Kelce, but the O-line is still dominant. I think this team should be on paper and theoretically a better team next year. Going back to the coaching staff, I still think the coaching staff is a big weak point for this team, but I don't think it will affect their regular season statistics and their overall performance. I think it might affect their playoffs more than anything, but I still have a lot of faith in guys like Jalen Hurts and AJ Brown, and I'm excited to see what Saquon Barkley can do behind an actually competent offensive line. And again, defensively, I don't think that this is a fantastic defense, but I still think there's a lot of good pieces that could make this defense potentially a top 15-ish unit. The linebacking core, in my opinion, is still very rough, but there is some young talent here with guys like Jeremiah Trotter and Nakobe Dean. Maybe one of those guys can become something next year. The secondary made a lot of big changes and a lot of big improvements. I'm excited to see Quinton Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. That's going to be a unit that won't be a total weak point for this roster. And then defensive line wise, you did lose a couple pieces, but it's still a very solid unit with guys like Jalen Carter, Bryce Huff, Josh Sweat, Milton Williams, and so on and so forth. So all in all, despite the disappointing playoff performance last year, I do suspect that the Philadelphia Eagles will bounce back next year. If you watched my NFC Contenders video, you know that I had the Philadelphia Eagles ranked number 4 in the NFC Contenders. But in the video, I explicitly said that they could potentially move up to number 3. I won't spoil that video. I'll have it pinned up probably at the end of the video, so if you want to check that out, you guys can after the video. In that video, I go into a bit more depth about the Philadelphia Eagles, so you might want to check it out. But I do think the Philadelphia Eagles are legitimate contenders within the NFC, so with that being said, I'm going to predict them to win somewhere between 11 to 13 games this year. Last year, they won 11 games. They got better in the offseason. I have a lot of faith in the team. Despite the coaching issues, I think they're a better team. Next up, let's talk about the New York Giants, a team that has been all over the headlines because of their involvement with the Hard Knocks TV show. And I think the Hard Knocks TV show has been honestly pretty interesting because it's pretty obvious and clear they've edited out a bunch of stuff that I think all of us fans would have liked to have heard at least. Because basically all we've been hearing from the Hard Knocks show, and by the way, when I'm making this video, we've only seen episode 2, so I haven't seen episode 3 or 4 whenever this does come out. But thus far, the show has really only showed off the Saquon Barkley situation and has basically been praising Daniel Jones. So to me, this is kind of a move by both Hard Knocks and the New York Giants to praise and defend their quarterback in Daniel Jones and to bash the new Philadelphia Eagle and Saquon Barkley. With that being said, though, I still think the New York Giants are actually going to be a decent team next year. They went 6-11 last year, and at certain points looked like a decent roster, but at certain points they also looked like the worst team in the league. Obviously, the majority of the time that Daniel Jones was healthy last year, he looked absolutely abysmal, but I think with some new additions along the offensive line and the newly acquired Malik Neighbors, I do think this offense could actually be secretly pretty mid at best. Like, I don't think the offense is going to be all of a sudden fantastic from being, one of the worst to now being something decent. Like, I still think Evan Neal is maybe the worst starting tackle in the league. I still think Devin Singletary should not be a starter for the New York Giants, and I still think the receiving core has some issues to figure out. But as long as Daniel Jones doesn't completely cost the team, I think this offense should at least be relatively average in comparison to the rest of the NFL. And then defensively speaking, there's a lot of really good pieces. I don't get why they let Xavier McKinney walk away. He was a freaking stud for this team, but they let him go to Green Bay, and I think that was an awesome pickup for the Packers. But you brought in guys like Brian Burns to help this defense out, and then you expect some players like Kayvon Thibodeau and Deonte Banks to continue to take some steps forward. So I actually think this defense could be relatively solid next year. Again, this is just on paper. We haven't seen it actually be performed on the field. So I think on paper, this team looks relatively okay. And when I say relatively okay or mid at best, that's like maybe the 20th or 21st best in the league. So I don't expect that the New York Giants are going to be picking number 1 in the draft, but I also don't think they're going to be anywhere close to the playoffs. I think the Commanders are their biggest competition for 3rd in the NFC East, but I do suspect that the Commanders have a much better chance of being better than the Giants, and the Giants do of being better than the Washington Commanders. So with that all being said, I'm going to predict the New York Giants to win somewhere between 5 to 8 games next year. I think if Daniel Jones performs pretty well next year and everything kind of works out nicely, this team could be kind of average at best. But I think what is more than likely going to happen is that this team is just going to be really okay and just about a 6-win team. But last up, let's talk about the Dallas Cowboys. Last year, they won the division. They went 12-5 and had every single thing going for them heading into the playoffs. And then they had the total embarrassment against the Green Bay Packers. I don't really have to tell the story over and over again. It was such a bizarre thing that I just could not believe happened when I was watching that game. Because all season long, the Dallas Cowboys were a pretty solid team. Yes, they had the embarrassment against the Bills and the Niners, but they beat the Detroit Lions and were extremely competitive with every other team, and they destroyed certain teams. But then they fumbled the bag in the playoffs, and that was just inexcusable. And now heading into 2024, the team is essentially a worser version of what they were last year. They lose their starting center, they lose Tyron Smith, they lose their starting running back and Tony Pollard. Their defense is still relatively the same, but it's just not as good as it was. And I'm just having a really hard time believing that the Dallas Cowboys are going to be better than what they were last year. I still think this team is way too talented to be a bad team. I still think they're going to make the playoffs pretty easily. And I do think that they still have a very solid chance of contending for the division. Because with their main core of guys, with guys like CD, Dak, Tyler Smith, Micah Parsons, and Deron Bland / Trevon Diggs, I still think that's a really solid core, and I still think this team is built for success this year. But when it comes down to it, like, let's just be honest, this team is a worse version of what they've been the past couple of years, and they haven't even been able to make it past the second round. So what makes me think that's going to change this year? You look at the rest of the NFC, and every other team has gotten significantly better, whereas for Dallas, they've gotten, I would say, significantly worse, if not a tad bit worse. And I don't know, I just have a lot of thoughts about this Dallas Cowboys team that I can't really just let off in a 2 or 3 minute video. I have a bunch of Cowboys videos on my channel because at certain points I defend some of their moves because I don't think it was the worst idea to do some of the things they did, but they're also just kind of a stagnant team that is quite obviously not going to be great next year. So I know that was just kind of a whole spiel, but let's just kind of briefly cover the roster because it's actually, again, not a bad roster. Dak Prescott's the quarterback. Some recent rumors and reports have come out that he's going to get a massive contract any day now, which I think is worth it for him. He's an awesome quarterback. Your running backs are going to be really bad next year, but maybe Rico Dowdle can be something. I'm interested to see Ezekiel Elliott in number 15. That's going to be something to look at. CeeDee Lamb, I think, will be the best receiver in the NFL next year. I think there's a very solid chance that he ends up as receiver 1 by the end of it. Then you got Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert. Not a lot to talk about there. They're just okay at this point. The offensive line is young, and I'm excited to see what they can do with new guys like Tyler Guyton and Cooper Beebe, but it's just mid, I guess. Jake Ferguson, awesome tight end. Defensively, a lot of good pieces. DeMarcus Lawrence, Osa Digizua, Micah Parsons, Eric Kendricks, Deron Bland, Malik Hooker, Trevon Diggs. Good talent, but let's just be honest. They'll probably win like 10 or 11 games and probably lose in the first round. Alrighty, guys. So I talked about each individual team, but now let's just do a total division preview. Obviously, last year, the order was Dallas in first, Philly in second, Washington in fourth, and then the New York Giants in 3. I think this year it's going to be a bit different. I do think the Philadelphia Eagles will win the division. Then I think it comes to Dallas, and then I think it goes Washington, and then I think it goes the Giants. Now, for me, the interesting story of the division is going to be, can Washington step up to a good enough level where maybe they could potentially jump the Dallas Cowboys? Because where the Washington Commanders were really bad last year, they fixed a ton of their issues, whereas for Dallas, they're essentially the same team plus a couple players, but it's a worser roster. So is there a chance that Dallas maybe goes from a 12-win team to maybe a 9-win team, whereas potentially Washington goes from like a 4-win team to like maybe a 9-win team and somehow jumps them from, some sort of advantage? Do I think that's likely? Not really. I do think Dallas will be over 10 wins next year and be a good team, but I do think it is something that we can at least watch. As for the New York Giants, I don't really have a lot of opinions about them. I think that this is a make or break year for Daniel Jones, and if he does his job at a high level, maybe he'll get in a couple more years to prove himself. But I think what's more than likely going to happen is that Daniel Jones will be mid to okay at best, and they'll eventually get a rookie quarterback to fill in that spot. Sort of think of Daniel Jones as basically a bridge quarterback. And then lastly, Philadelphia, not really much to talk about here. I think I explained most of it in my brief preview for them. They're a good team, and they should be the favorites within the NFC East at least, and I think at some point they could maybe be the favorites out of the NFC because it's a really good roster. But you guys tell me, who do you guys think is going to win the NFC East? Do you guys believe that I was correct, or do you guys think that I was wrong? And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.